Behind me is a 2024 Toyota Prius Prime, and I'm gonna bring you guys along as I turn it into a hot hatch. The Prius Prime is plenty quick in a straight line thanks to its internal combustion engine combined with electric motors for a total system output of 220 horsepower. While the Prius handles incredibly well and is even tighter in the corners than I expected, this class of vehicle tends to be built to understeer just because of the nature of the average person that's driving it. And in this case, the tires, because they are low rolling resistance to be as efficient as possible, are really the biggest detriment because they get overwhelmed rather quickly. The main goal of this project is to improve the handling and also the appearance whenever possible. But I want to try to do that with parts that are already in the Toyota parts bin if available. This is my biggest score so far. This is a 19-inch forged wheel that is an F-Sport wheel for the Lexus NX. So this was an dealer installed, I believe, optional wheel from Lexus. But the cool thing is the offset's very similar to what I need. The hub size is the same, so this is basically a direct match. And because it's forged, it only weighs a couple pounds more than the 17-inch wheels that are on the car right now. To get a baseline of where we're starting from, we'll get some measurements here at the fender openings just to get things like our ride height. And as you can see, the front here is at around 27.5 inches. If we do the same in the rear, we can see that we're at a pretty similar measurement, as this also measures at right around 27.5. Let's get the wheels and tires off so we can start work on installing the suspension components and getting the car lowered. It may seem like our first order of business should be in the wheel well. It's actually up here. So these wipers and this cover here block access to the top hats on each side, so we can't get to those bolts. So in order to do that, we'll have to pop a couple of bolts off here, another bolt off there, pull both of the wipers out. Then we're going to take this cover out, and then underneath is a wiper transmission. We'll pull that out, and then there's a rain gutter that we'll also pull out, and then that'll give us access to everything back here, including those top hats. It sounds a little complex, but it's actually not that complicated. There is some good news after removing the cover, because the actual wiper transmission doesn't have to come out because the nuts are actually visible here for the strut top. So we should be able to remove them without removing the rest of this, and then be able to just put the plastic and all that stuff that we took off back. We're putting lowering springs on the stock Prius struts, and we're going to install them back on the car. The front springs were a pretty straightforward affair, typical McPherson strut stuff, just unbolt and bolt back together. The only real complication was obviously pulling the windshield wipers and some of the trim to get to the strut top mounts, but other than that, it's pretty easy. The spring is divorced from the shock in the rear, so that's a pretty easy install. Just kind of had to unbolt the bolt here, lower this lower mount, stick the new spring in there, and then bolt it all back together. Everything's back on the car, and after a short test drive, it looks like the fronts have settled to right around 26.5, maybe just a little bit lower than that. The rears have also settled a similar amount, and we're around 26.125 or so in the back, so pretty decent drop, and the car actually feels very similar. After driving around a bit more, the springs settled to about 1.5 inches lower than stock, and provided for an absolutely excellent stance, as you can see here on the stock wheels and tires. The best part of the spring install is that they tighten things up in the suspension, allowing for much better cornering, but without introducing any unnecessary harshness. Our next project now was to swap out the wheels and tires for the forged units. Now that we have a ride height sorted, we can focus on the wheels and tires. So what you see down here is a 17-inch wheel with a plastic aero cover. It's basically like a hubcap. And around that is a Bridgestone Ecopia low rolling resistance tire. This wheel and tire combination is obviously intended for efficiency, as the Ecopias are low rolling resistance tires, so they aren't really great in the handling department. So we want something that handles a little bit better in the corners, as well as looks a little bit better, so we're going to change that.
Fortunately, I was able to track down some 19 by 7.5 inch forged aluminum wheels that were originally intended for the Lexus NX200T, and these were optional F-Sport wheels. Since they are forged, they are pretty lightweight, and I decided to wrap them in Michelin Pilot Sport All-Season 4 tires. I originally considered Pilot Sport 4S, but since it's getting cold here now, I figured that All-Season is probably the best option for the time being. As we set the tires and wheels side by side, you'll notice that the outside diameter is roughly the same, but we have a 225/40/19 on the left versus a 195/60/17 on the right. What that means is that we have a little bit more width, but the diameter is the same, which means that it shouldn't affect the speedometer significantly. Based on my calculations, it's roughly about 0.5%, which will be 0.3 of a mile at 60 miles an hour. There is obviously an impact to the weight because this is a bigger wheel and a wider tire, so there's more mass. But for me, the trade-off was worth it to get a little bit more rubber on the road. The difference in tread width is pretty easy to see once you take a closer look here from above, and that is partly where some of that weight comes from. But as you can see, the diameter is almost identical, which is great for keeping the speedometer calibration correct. The 17-inch wheels look pretty fascinating with the plastic aero hubcaps removed, and as you can see, they packaged them very tightly to these 11-inch brakes in here. The original Prius wheel was a 17 by 6.5, and this is a 19 by 7.5, so we have added a little bit of width, but there is only 1 millimeter of difference in the offset, so it fits quite nicely inside the fender well, and the gap is really perfect with these springs. One of the other nice things about using an OEM wheel from a Lexus is that the hub is a match. So they're both a 62 millimeter hub, so no hub centering ring is required to install these wheels. As these were an optional Lexus wheel, they obviously have F-Sport badging. I'll see if I can find some matching Toyota ones, but for now, this should do just fine.
Swapping out just a few parts has changed the aesthetics of the car incredibly and made it so much more fun to drive on back roads without having a huge impact on efficiency. In the next video, we'll dig into that as well as future modifications.